You are a princess. You've never been kissed. And every night you write letters to someone who doesn't know your name. You are not the kind of princess the poets sing about. There are no balls in your honor. No tower of suitors waiting outside your window. Your father rules a kingdom wrapped in the chill of war, and your mother speaks in careful silences. Your room is lined with scrolls, not dresses. You eat alone, speak little, and walk only in places no one watches. And yet you are a princess. Every morning the maids bring your bath. Every afternoon your tutors arrive with pages of politics and prophecy. And every evening you slip away quietly without anyone noticing to your favorite place, a half-forgotten garden at the edge of the palace grounds. There, beneath the twisting branches of a crooked willow, you sit on a worn stone bench with your hands folded in your lap. The flowers here bloom late, and even the bees seem tired. But you don't mind. The quiet here belongs to you, and so do the letters. You don't remember the first one you wrote. Not really. It wasn't a plan. There was no secret plot, no love story in your mind. Just one lonely night, one restless hour, one folded note tucked between ledgers in a diplomatic pouch. You called it a poem, but really it was just a whisper. Something your heart needed to say out loud. You signed it, only saying, "From the girl in the garden." You never expected a reply, and for a while there wasn't one. The days passed. You went back to lessons and silence and the long shadows of the garden. You almost forgot you'd ever written it. But one morning, a week later, a new pouch arrived. Inside, beneath a military inventory list scribbled in stiff black ink, you found 6 more words. To the girl in the garden. Your words made this week feel less like war. That's all. No name, no seal, no promise. But something inside you opened that night. You wrote again. Not a poem this time, but a letter. A real one. You told him your favorite tree in the garden is the one with the bent spine and twisted trunk, because it looks like it's praying. You told him that some days you wish you were born as a stone on a mountain, or a shadow on the wall, something that no one expected anything from. You folded it quietly and slipped it into the next diplomatic exchange, and he answered. He always answered. Sometimes days passed, sometimes weeks. Sometimes his letters were only 3 lines. Sometimes they were 3 pages. But he never stopped, and neither did you. You don't know his name. You know only that he's a soldier, an officer, a boy with quiet hands and a tired heart, and maybe a secret garden of his own somewhere far away. And slowly, over many months, you began to fall in love with the man behind the letters. Not the kind of love that dances in courtyards. Not the kind sung by choirs or carved into rings. But the kind that aches in the quiet. The kind that builds without permission. The kind that waits for you in every sunset, every page, every silence. Tonight's story is about that kind of love. A love that never meant to begin and never quite knew how to end. It's a story of 2 strangers who should have been enemies, but found something soft in the shadows. A story about how words can cross borders that armies never could. About how a girl with too many walls wrote a letter without hope, and how a boy, carrying too many wounds, opened it like a prayer. It's about the garden she wrote from, the battlefield he answered from, and the fragile, impossible bridge they built, one folded page at a time. It's about longing and silence, and the kind of patience only love knows. So if you're tired, stay. If you're aching, stay. If your heart is full or broken or simply quiet tonight, stay. Let your eyes fall heavy. Let your thoughts wander. Let the world grow soft around the edges. Because tonight, I'll tell you the story of the princess who wrote love letters to her enemy as son, not knowing if he would ever read them, not knowing if he would ever care, not knowing if love, born in secret, could survive in a world that was built to keep them apart. But he did read them, and he did care. And though the world tried again and again to silence them, they kept writing, until silence turned into something else entirely, until it became a story worth remembering. And now, it's yours. Before we begin, if you enjoy slow stories like this, ones about longing, memory, and quiet love, you might want to subscribe. Here, we tell tales for those who can't sleep, for those who miss someone, or for those who just need to hear something soft at the end of the day. So if that's you, press subscribe, tap the bell, and come back any night you need a little escape. Now, close your eyes, take a breath, and let's begin. The war had stolen many things from her: music, laughter, the scent of orange blossoms in spring. But more than anything, it had stolen the silence between moments. Everything now was noise: metal scraping against stone, boots drilling in the square, whispers behind heavy doors, the sound of her mother's old harp gathering dust in the corner of the room. She was a princess, yes, but titles meant very little in a kingdom unraveling from within. Every morning she was dressed and presented like a porcelain statue. Every evening she was escorted back into the castle by guards with tired eyes, and in between she waited, she watched, she wondered how many more names the war would take. But the garden still belonged to her, tucked away behind ivy-covered walls and rose-woven trellises. It had somehow survived the fires of war. The gardeners had long been conscripted. The hedges had grown wild, but the willow tree still stood, arms open, and the stone bench beneath it still remembered the shape of her. This was where she would sit, just before dusk, when the bells stopped ringing and the sky turned honey-colored. And this is where the idea first came to her. It was not a strategy, not a message sent through channels, just a thought, a whisper, that maybe someone, somewhere, might understand. Earlier that day, she had overheard something, a conversation between her father and his advisors. They were reviewing intercepted supply lists from the border, enemy scrolls, dull, repetitive, often discarded. She watched as one of the scribes rolled them up for the archives. No one would read them again. That night, beneath the willow, she carried one of those empty scrolls. She stole it from the archive. While no one was looking, the back was blank, and no one would miss it. And on that back, with a quill dipped in midnight ink, she wrote not a strategy, but a poem, not a declaration of war, but a confession of longing. They say the stars are quieter across your border. I wonder if you hear them better than we do. If the sky is kinder where you sleep, if you sleep at all. She signed it with only 5 small words, from the girl in the garden. No name, no title, just a dream folded in parchment. She didn't expect a reply. She didn't expect anyone to read it. She folded it 3 times and tucked it back into the scroll tube, replacing it among the others. It was foolish. She knew that. But it was the only foolish thing she'd allowed herself in months, and it felt necessary. On the other side of the border, days away by horseback, he was reading ledgers by candlelight, His name was Cassian, the general's son, the commander in training of the 3rd Western Regiment. By day, he held swords and issued commands. By night, he read reports. Dry, routine, endless reports. But that night, something strange caught his eye. A small scroll, slightly heavier than the others. Inside, a crumpled parchment with words written in a hand unlike any he'd seen. He read it once, then again. It was not coded, it was not tactical, it was quiet, almost afraid, and it was addressed to no one, and yet, somehow to him, he turned the parchment over. No seal, no sender, but at the bottom. From the girl in the garden, he stared at those words for a long time, as if they had come from a world that no longer existed, as if they had somehow slipped through the cracks of war. He didn't know what moved him. Maybe it was the weariness in his bones, or the memory of the sister he'd lost the year before. But on the back of a supply list in a cramped script, he wrote, "To the girl in the garden, your words made this week feel less like war. No name, no title, just ink and hope." He passed it to a courier, said it was to be returned with the original scrolls, addressed for archival review. It was a lie, but there had been too many lies already. One more wouldn't hurt. 3 weeks passed, not quickly, not quietly. Each day dragged like a cart with a broken wheel. In those weeks, the war crept closer. Her father's voice grew louder behind the council room doors. More names were written on stone. More towns were marked in red ink. And she went to the garden every evening, just in case. She never told herself she was waiting. Waiting would have meant hope. And hope was something she'd carefully taught herself not to feel. She sat beneath the willow and picked at the bark. She traced the lines in the stone bench with her thumb. She watched clouds crawl across the sky, whispering nothing. And every so often, when no one was near, she whispered to the tree. He didn't write back, as if the tree might answer, as if it might tell her that boys at war don't write poems to strangers, not even princesses. She returned to her routines. She sat at council meetings, mostly quiet. The men spoke in circles, while her mind drifted. She walked the edge of the palace each afternoon, spoke softly to the old stable mare, read the same pages of the same book again and again, forgetting what came next. And then, on the 22nd day, something changed. It was late afternoon. The sun had turned the hallways gold. Her father was speaking with the mapkeeper, and she was left alone in the archives. She liked it. There, where the dust didn't care who she was, a fresh stack of military scrolls had been brought in that morning. Enemy supply ledgers, captured and catalogued for reference. No one reads them anymore. They were routine, repetitive, forgotten. But something made her pause. The scrolls were bundled with coarse twine, the top one slightly misaligned. She had no reason to look, but her fingers reached anyway. She told herself she was just tidy, just curious, but her hands trembled as she untied the bundle. The second scroll from the top was different, lighter, thinner. She unrolled it halfway, and there, at the bottom of the page, beneath columns of figures and root names, was a line, not official, not part of the ledger, just 5 words, scrawled hastily, like they barely made it to the page, to the girl in the garden. Your words made this week feel less like war. That was all. No signature, no seal, no return message tucked neatly in a scroll tube, just that single line. At first, she thought it might be a mistake, a trick, but the ink had bled slightly at the edges. Rushed handwriting on low-grade parchment. It was real. Her throat tightened. She held the scroll like it might disappear. She read the line again, then again, and again, 6 times, then 7, until her breath became shallow and her eyes wet. It wasn't poetry, it wasn't long, but it was proof. Someone had heard her. Someone had read the poem, and impossibly, someone had written back. She hid the scroll beneath her sleeve. Her heartbeat thudded like a war drum. She left the archives without saying a word. No one noticed. She didn't go to her room. She didn't eat. Instead, she ran barefoot down the gravel path behind the old fountain, through the side gate she had long since unlocked, to the only place in the world that still felt like hers, the garden. By the time she reached the willow, the sun was dipping below the wall. The sky was rose-colored and heavy. She sat on the bench, clutching the scroll. Then, slowly, carefully, she unfolded new parchment from her sleeve. This time, she had come prepared. This time, she would not write a poem, but a letter. She told him about the garden, how the ivy, overgrown the northern gate, how the lilies bloomed late this year, how the doves still came, even though nothing else did. She didn't explain who she was, not yet, but she told him she was lonely, and that his words had made her feel less invisible. She wrote, "I don't know who you are, but thank you for writing back." And then, after a long pause, she added, "I'll be here again, if you ever feel like answering." She folded the letter slowly, sealed it with wax from her bedside candle. No crest, no emblem. And the next morning, before the couriers took their leave, she slipped the letter into a returning stack of scrolls, just like before. No one saw, no one would question a princess near the records table. And just like that, she'd written again. But this time, it wasn't a whisper into the dark. This time, she knew someone was listening. The second letter came 5 days later. She found it by accident, though by then, part of her had started looking. Not obviously, not like someone waiting for a reply, but in quiet ways. Slower fingers when she unrolled the scrolls. Eyes that lingered just a second longer on the margins of military reports. A hesitation, like someone standing at the edge of hope, unsure whether to jump. This one wasn't hidden in the pile. It was buried, tucked between 2 pages of inventory reports, wedged so deep she almost missed it entirely. She was in the council chamber that morning, standing beside her father's scribe as he read out supply tallies for the northern fort. She wasn't listening. The numbers blurred into each other: flour, timber, oil, salt. Her fingers idly flipped through the stack until her thumb caught something. Not parchment, stained faintly with dust and pressed thin from travel. She unfolded it slowly, and her heart forgot its rhythm. There were only a few lines, written in uneven ink, as if the pen had been dipped hastily. To the girl in the garden, your words stayed with me longer than I meant to let them. I thought I would forget them. I didn't. I don't know why I'm writing this, but thank you. You made this place feel less like war. That was it. No signature, no crest, not even a mark of rank. Just a fold of linen that smelled faintly of pine and words. That didn't belong in a war room. She folded it twice, slid it into her sleeve, and said nothing. Not when the scribe asked if she was well, not when her lady-in-waiting asked if she was cold, but her hands were trembling. That night, she didn't wait for sleep to fall. She slipped away early, before the candles were put out, before her maid had brushed out the last of her braids. She made her way down the long hallway barefoot, holding her skirts in one hand, the other clutching parchment so tight it creased. The willow tree waited in the dark like it always did, swaying gently as if it already knew she was coming. This time she brought more than a scrap of poetry. She brought a real letter. It began with a story, not about war, not about the council or the border, about the garden behind her chambers, the little hidden gate with the loose hinge. How, when she was 10, she'd pretended she was a fairy queen and made daisy crowns for the birds. How, when she was 16, she'd stolen kisses from a stable hand under the old fig tree, and how that had ended with shame and exile, and how now, at 23, she spent most of her time pretending she didn't feel anything at all. She didn't ask who he was, didn't guess. She didn't want to break the magic. She only ended it with, "I don't know who you are, but thank you for writing back." And then, in the smallest writing, at the bottom of the page, "I'll be here again. If you ever feel like answering." She didn't sign it with a name. She didn't need to. She returned to her room without making a sound. Not even the guards noticed her. And if they did, they were used to her late-night walks. After all, what harm could a lonely girl do, wandering her own gardens? But inside, her mind was racing. What if he never saw the letter? What if someone else found it? What if he never writes again? She told herself it didn't matter, that it was just a whisper in the dark, a flicker of something silly, a game. But still, for the first time in a long while, she slept with her window open, just in case a breeze might carry something back. 3 more days passed. She kept her routine, sat through council meetings, listened to old men argue about grain shortages and fortress repairs, smiled politely when noble sons bowed. Too low, practiced her needlework without threading the needle. But every evening, her heart beat faster near sundown. Not from love, she didn't dare call it that, but from hope, from ache, from the strange sweetness of being known by someone who didn't know her name. She had almost given up hope. She'd return to the willow each night like clockwork, slipping small notes between its roots, listening to the wind rustle through the leaves as if it might carry a reply back. But nothing came. Maybe she was foolish to believe this secret correspondence could last. Maybe someone had caught him. Or maybe he'd grown tired of writing to a stranger. But something kept her returning. Hope, perhaps, or longing, or something quieter than either, a kind of aching stillness she didn't know how to silence. Then, on the 4th morning, she couldn't sleep. The air was silver with pre-dawn fog, and the castle was still. No footsteps in the halls, no clang of armor, no bells from the tower. She slipped on her cloak and crept outside, not to the willow, not at first. This time, her feet pulled her toward the outer garden wall, a place where crates of firewood were sometimes left, along with deliveries from the northern outposts. She'd walked past it 1,000 times. It was never anything special. But today, something caught her eye. A small pile of flat stones near the edge of the wall, undisturbed except for one. It was tilted at an angle, ever so slightly. Her breath caught. She crouched down, heart pounding, and gently lifted the stone. There it was, a folded piece of parchment, tough and worn, not the kind she used for royal letters, but rough soldier's hide, cured to withstand weather and sweat. The wax seal had cracked. The edges were smudged with dirt. It had clearly been left in a hurry, maybe at night, maybe by someone who couldn't risk being seen. She looked around quickly. The garden was empty, still. No one had followed her. Hands trembling, she unfolded the letter, holding her breath like it might vanish if she exhaled too loud. I think about you when I can't sleep. I don't know who you are, but I know the kind of person who writes what you wrote. Someone kind, someone lonely, someone brave. There are things I'd say to you if I could, things I've never told anyone, but I'm afraid I'll ruin this. I'm afraid if I say too much, you'll stop. So I'll just say this. I read your letter 10 times. I kept it under my pillow, and I smiled when I shouldn't have. I'll write again if you want me to. She didn't move for a long time, just stood there, surrounded by mist, parchment trembling in her hands, heart aching in a way that felt too big for her chest. He had read her words. He had remembered. He had written back, and not out of duty or games or mockery, but because something in him was reaching too. She clutched the letter to her chest and whispered into the fog, I do want you to write again. Then she turned back toward the willow, already composing her reply. This time it would be longer. This time she would tell him something real. This time the girl in the garden would write from the heart. There was something reckless blooming between them now. Not love, not yet, but something dangerous and delicate. A vine growing between walls. They never used names, never spoke of where or who, just moments, just thoughts, just presence. Every few days, a new note appeared, hidden in the quiet places only the girl knew to look. Behind the 4th stone of the east garden wall, tucked into the hollow of the oldest tree, sometimes inside a folded linen napkin, delivered under the guise of a diplomatic message from the outer camp. Sometimes so hidden it made her doubt it was real at all. But it always arrived, and somehow always when she needed it most. One night, a storm came through the capital. The garden flooded. The branches lashed and wailed against the windows. She stayed up late, listening to the wind scream. And when the morning broke, cold and bright, she tiptoed barefoot into the mud, heart racing, hair damp from the air, to see if the last letter had survived. It had, soaked, stained, torn along the edge, but still legible. His scrawl, angled and impatient, was still there. You asked what I see when I close my eyes. I see the edge of your voice, and the sound it makes when no one answers. She pressed the ruined paper to her chest like a relic, then carefully, reverently, tucked it into the lining of her sewing box, where no guard or servant would ever think to look. But secrecy, like fire, is hard to contain, and this fire was growing fast. A month had passed since that first scribbled reply. They had written to each other 13 times, and already it was too many. The gardener had started noticing the moved stones. The seamstress had caught her lingering too long by the windows. The steward asked her twice why the parchment. Rolls were going missing faster than usual. Even the queen, her stepmother, had narrowed her gaze once at breakfast and said, with clipped suspicion, "You've been quiet lately. Is something occupying your imagination?" The girl smiled, soft and polite. "No, my queen, just the weather." But her fingers trembled as they reached for the teacup, because someone was occupying her imagination. Someone who wasn't allowed to exist inside her world. Then came the day that nearly ended it all. It was late afternoon. The air outside was gold and heavy, and she had slipped away early to the small stone path behind the dovecote, their new drop point. But when she reached into the hollow where the letter should have been, her fingers met another hand, warm, real, not his, not hers, but a servant girl, startled, eyes wide, mouth open, holding the parchment she hadn't yet had time to retrieve. Both froze. Time collapsed into silence. Then the princess did something she hadn't done since she was a child. She begged, "Please, don't tell." Her voice cracked. Her dignity fell. The servant stared, torn between duty and shock. And finally, slowly, she tucked the parchment back into the hole. "I didn't see anything, Your Highness," the girl whispered, and disappeared into the hedges. That night, the princess didn't write back. She paced the halls of her chamber until dawn, heart racing, breath short. One discovery, just one, and everything would unravel. The letters, her safety, his safety, and yet the ache in her hands was unbearable. She needed to write, even if she never sent it. So she took out the parchment and a bit of worn charcoal and wrote her longest letter yet, a story of the garden, of the girl who couldn't speak, of the fear that tasted like iron. She folded it, tied it with twine, and buried it under her mattress. 3 days passed. No letter came. She told herself he had grown bored, or he had realized the danger, or he'd been ordered back to the front, or worse, that someone else had found out. But on the 4th day, at sunrise, her eyes flew open, because there, on the windowsill, was a single sprig of blue sage, and tied to its stem, barely visible, was a thread of parchment, curled and sun-bleached. It read, "If you can't send a letter, just leave a flower. I'll understand." She clutched the note like a lifeline and began to cry. Not because she was afraid, but because someone out there, somewhere in enemy colors, had just promised to wait for her. The letters continued for weeks, slowly, carefully, like stolen breaths between storms. Each one was a quiet miracle, passed beneath shutters, folded into the binding of court scrolls, or tucked beneath ivy leaves by the wall where no one ever looked. Sometimes days passed between replies, sometimes longer, and each time she thought the silence meant it was over, that he'd been caught. Or worse, the next letter would arrive like a sigh in the dark. She kept them hidden beneath the stone slab beneath her bed, wrapped in a silk scarf her mother once left behind. It was the only thing she had of her, and now the only place that felt sacred enough for this secret. Each note was folded and refolded until the edges curled. His ink always faded by the time she read it, rushed, blotched, often written by candlelight in the dead. Hours between drills or sentries, but still, he wrote. He never signed his name. She never asked him to. He didn't know who she was, not truly, only that she was a girl with ink-stained fingers, who tended to roses no one else noticed, and who left behind poetry where others left footprints. And yet, somehow, he understood her, more than the noblemen who danced in her court, more than the guards who flanked her throne, even more, perhaps, than the nursemaid who raised her. But every letter brought risk, and eventually that risk caught up to them. It started with a sound, a simple one, really, the scrape of boots across gravel just outside the palace gardens, far too early for the gardeners and far too quiet to be one of the loud, drunken guardsmen. She was under the willow tree that morning, pen in hand, halfway through describing the sound of wind through glass windows when she heard it. She froze. The letter was still damp with ink. Her hands trembled as she slipped the paper between the roots, beneath the same hollow stone they'd used before. Then, footsteps, a figure, too close, too sudden. She turned just as a shadow fell across the path. It wasn't him. It was her cousin, Lord Everick, the son of the Chancellor. A boy who had always watched her with an odd mixture of entitlement and curiosity. He wasn't cruel, but he wasn't kind either. He had once tried to gift her a falcon and became furious when she gave it to a wounded stable hand instead. "What are you doing out here alone?" he asked. She forced a smile. "Just writing." He stepped closer, too close. His gaze drifted toward the roots of the tree. "Is that why you've been slipping off before first light each morning?" Her heart stuttered. She said nothing. Everett crouched down beside the stone, not reaching, just looking, almost as if he didn't want to see. Not really, but something in him did. "You've always been strange," he said, a smile curling at the edges of his lips. "But I suppose that's what makes you interesting." She felt her breath tighten. "It's peaceful here," she said quietly. "I like the quiet." He looked at her, long and searching. "Be careful, cousin. People talk. And your father is already suspicious about your morning walks." Then he left, just like that. But her hands didn't stop shaking for hours. She didn't sleep that night. She sat by her window with the letter unopened beside her, wondering if she should burn it or all of them. She had seen what happened when court girls were caught sneaking letters. A servant girl once lost a hand. Another vanished entirely. But still, the next morning she went back. Because when the world presses too tightly against your ribs, when the weight of who you're supposed to be threatens to crush who you are, a single sentence from someone who sees the real you can be enough to breathe again. This time, she didn't bring ink. She brought the scarf and one of her favorite books, a book of old songs and prayers passed down from queens before her. And she left the scarf inside it, folded around a single note. "I'm scared," it read, "and I don't know your name, but I think I would miss your words if they stopped coming." That was all. She didn't ask for more. She didn't dare. But 2 nights later, as she passed the outer garden gate, she found the book leaning quietly against the wall where she'd left it. No guard would notice it. There no maid would care to look. It was only she who saw it. The scarf was missing. Inside the front cover, scrawled in dark, uneven ink, were just 2 lines. "I don't know who you are either, but I'd miss your words, too, more than I should." No signature, no seal, but she could feel him in the spaces between the letters. She pressed her hand to the page, heart thudding. They were being watched. The risks had grown sharper, the shadows around them thicker, but still, he had written back, and that was enough. For now, they never said each other's names. Not once, not aloud, not even in writing. In the beginning, it was for protection, a way to stay invisible inside a world that would never forgive them for speaking. But later, it became something else. Because, in a way, names were too small, too fragile, too sharp, and what they had, whatever it was, felt like something that would shatter if they gave it a label. So they became the girl in the garden and the boy behind the wall. They wrote to each other without identity, yet every word was stitched with the soul of who they were. For a time, their letters were everything. He would send 3 lines, she would return 6. He would fold pressed violets inside the crease of parchment. She would trace them with her finger, then leave them in the pages of her hidden journal. But the war outside did not sleep. The princess heard its rumble in every distant hoofbeat, in every shouted order across the courtyards. She saw its growing shadow in the face of her father. Once warm, now harder, more worn. There were nights she stayed up by candlelight, rereading his letters, until the wax melted down and pooled over the words, just to feel less alone. And there were nights she didn't write at all, not because she didn't want to, but because the ache had turned inward and she couldn't find the courage to hope. She never knew what his world looked like, not really, but sometimes his words painted it. He described frost-laced mornings when the campfire smoked slowly and the men stirred with stiff fingers. He described a small sparrow who had built her nest in the spokes of a war chariot. No one had the heart to move it, so the chariot stayed. Once he described his boots falling apart and how he'd tied them with twine. The twine, he joked, has held up better than the king's promises. She smiled at that one for a whole hour. But eventually, the letters stopped. Not suddenly, not cruelly, just one didn't come, then another. She waited. She made excuses. Maybe he was traveling. Maybe there was a new commander. Maybe they were watching the wall. She whispered those maybes every morning when she sat beneath the willow with a fresh letter in her lap, a letter he would never see. Weeks passed, then months. Spring crept into the garden. The flowers bloomed. Her heart didn't. She began to change, not in a way anyone could see, but inside, in the quiet, unwitnessed corners. She started rising early, long before the servants. She walked the empty halls, not to reach anywhere, just to feel the stillness, to remind herself she was still real. Her hand still moved across parchment, but now the letters stayed folded in a drawer. Every morning she reread them, the ones he sent, the ones she never mailed. The ink began to fade, but her memory did not. She remembered how he had once said he hated onions, how he secretly loved the smell of horses after rain, how he learned to read late, and how he still traced his finger under the words when he was tired. She remembered everything he never told her, and everything she imagined in the silence. Elsewhere, he was alive, just far, and no longer free. The boy behind the wall had become a soldier in a battle that had long lost its meaning. He had tried to write, he really had. But after one letter was intercepted and burned, and nearly cost a stable boy his hand, he stopped. It wasn't worth the risk, not for him, but especially not for her. She was a princess. He had never deserved to read her words in the first place. But on nights when the others slept, he would close his eyes and whisper from the girl in the garden, and he'd imagine her handwriting. He still remembered the tilt of her cheek, how her ink sometimes smudged when she wrote too fast. He still carried her words, memorized, tucked deep in his memory like contraband stitched under his skin. The silence grew. Years passed. They grew too. She began to speak at the council. He began to lead. She learned diplomacy. He learned survival. She looked across the border and wondered if she'd imagined him. He looked up at the stars and wondered if she'd forgotten him. But somehow, through time, through distance, through silence, they never stopped writing her in his memory. And she never stopped waiting in some corner of her soul for a letter that would never come. One night, she opened the drawer of her old letters, unfolded the first one, and as she read, she whispered softly, "I don't know your name, but I hope you're alive." Far away, a man stood in a quiet orchard, watching the wind dance through the trees. And for reasons he couldn't name, he smiled, as if somewhere, in a world long ago and nearly forgotten, someone was still listening. The snow came early that year. It hadn't snowed in the capital in almost 3 winters. But that morning, just as the frost began to etch itself across the palace windows, tiny flakes drifted like whispered prayers across the sky. And in the west, beyond the hills that separated kingdoms, a soldier turned toward home. But this isn't about him yet, not entirely. It begins with her, still waiting, still pretending she wasn't. The princess had stopped writing, not because her heart had healed, but because the silence had begun to feel like its own kind of letter. Long, heavy, and never-ending. Months had passed since the last message. Seasons changed, and with them, the rhythm of her days. She no longer lingered by the garden wall, no longer stared at blank parchment in the candlelight, wondering if he was safe, or if he was gone. Instead, she walked faster through the corridors, spoke less, smiled only when someone was looking, and most nights she sat by the hearth with a book in her lap, one she never really read, and let the fire's crackle fill the room where silence used to ache. But the ache never left. It simply hid deeper on that winter morning. She stood at her chamber window as the snow fell. She remembered something he had once written, barely a sentence, tucked in the margin of a letter. I hope you see snow this year. I hope it makes the world feel soft again. She hadn't thought about that line in months, but now, seeing the world turned white, her breath caught. The ache rushed back in, sudden and sharp. She closed her eyes and almost didn't hear the knock at the door. It wasn't loud, just two gentle taps, barely enough to stir a memory. But something told her to answer it. When she opened the door, no one was there. Only a servant girl's shadow fading down the hallway. And on the floor, resting against the doorframe, was a box, wrapped in plain linen, tied with a green ribbon faded from time. Her hands trembled as she reached for it. She didn't open it right away. She couldn't. Instead, she carried it to the old writing desk, the same one where she had once written letters full of longing and laughter, never expecting answers. Now she untied the ribbon. Inside, a stack of parchment, aged yellowed at the corners, each one sealed with wax, each one addressed to her. There were seven letters, all dated over the past year, one for each moon. Her hands began to shake. She opened the first. It was his handwriting, clear, sure, the way he always wrote when he was steady. I don't know if these will reach you, but writing them makes it easier to breathe. That was the first line. The rest of the page blurred as tears filled her eyes. She read for hours, one letter at a time, slowly, carefully. Each page a window into his months without her, his fear, his fatigue, his hope, how he'd nearly died from a wound to the ribs, how he dreamed of her voice when the pain made sleep impossible, how he once saw a garden through a village gate and thought he'd finally gone mad from missing her. There are days I wonder if I imagined you, but I don't care. If I did, I'd imagine you again. One letter ended with a pressed sprig of lavender, dry now, crumbling at the edge. Another had a sketch of her garden wall, scrawled in pencil between two paragraphs. Do you still go there? She cried harder at that line than all the others, because she hadn't gone there in so long. As the firelight faded, she opened the seventh letter. It was shorter than the others, only a few lines. If this reaches you, and if you still care, I'll be in the clearing, beyond the frost bridge, on the first snow. She looked up from the letter. Snow. She ran, didn't change, didn't think, just gathered her cloak and ran. Down the stairs, past the guards, through the gates. No one stopped her. Maybe they knew. She crossed the frost bridge, a place she hadn't dared go since the war, since the letters stopped. The air bit at her cheeks, but she didn't slow. She reached the clearing. The world was quiet, empty, but then she heard it. A crunch of snow behind her. She turned, and there he was, older, thinner, a scar along his cheekbone. But it was him. He stood still, afraid to breathe. So was she. No words, just snow between them. And then she stepped forward, and he dropped his pack. And they ran. She hit his chest like a wave, and he caught her like he'd been waiting his whole life to do so. Neither spoke for a long time. She pressed her ear to his heart just to hear it, to be sure it was real. He buried his face in her hair and said nothing, because sometimes silence says everything. When they finally parted, just an inch between them, he whispered the first real sentence in years. "You didn't sign your last letter." She smiled through the tears. "That's because I hoped you'd come." And so he had. And so they stood in a clearing dusted in snow, hearts still racing, stories still unwritten, but for the first time, not apart. The wind calmed. The snowfall softened. It was like the world had decided to pause, to let them have this moment undisturbed. He reached for her hands, unsure if he was allowed. But she placed hers in his before he could ask. They were cold, not from the weather, from waiting. He rubbed them gently between his palms, trying to warm what time had left frozen. "I thought I'd forgotten your voice," he said, almost in awe. "But now I hear it, and I realize I remembered it exactly." She didn't respond right away. Her lips trembled with too many words trying to come at once. "I used to imagine what you'd say if you came back," she whispered. "But this is better than one could imagine." He smiled then, the same crooked smile she had drawn from memory so many times. "I didn't know if I'd ever be strong enough," he admitted, "to come back, to see what you'd become without me." She shook her head. "I didn't become anything," she said. "I waited." He frowned slightly. "But I left. For too long." Her voice was quiet but firm. "You wrote. That's all that ever mattered." And then, because the moment demanded it, they sat together, beneath the bare-boned trees, on a log half covered in snow. It didn't matter that it was cold, that she hadn't eaten, that neither of them had any idea what came next. They had time now, all the time they'd lost, and maybe a little more. He pulled something from his satchel, a worn, creased envelope. "I brought one more letter," he said, "but I never sent it. I wasn't sure if I should." She reached out, hesitated, and then took it from him. Reverent, careful. "Why didn't you send it?" He looked out across the quiet fields. "Because it was a goodbye, and I didn't want it to be true." She held the letter close to her chest. "Then don't let it be." They didn't speak for a while after that. Instead, they watched the snow fall, gentle and slow, like it had all the time in the world. She leaned her head against his shoulder. He tilted his cheek against her hair. He smelled like winter and ink and worn leather, and beneath it, something familiar, the scent of hope. "Eventually," she asked, "what happens now?" He didn't answer right away. Then softly, "We find a way to begin again. In a world that's still broken, especially in a world that's broken." She smiled, eyes glistening. "You never stopped sounding like your letters. You never stopped being the girl in the garden." They stayed until the sun began to slip behind the hills. Neither of them moved. Because sometimes, after all the storms and silences and aching distance, just sitting beside the person you once only dreamed about feels like enough. no more whispers across borders, no more words on parchment, just a beginning made of breath and snow and everything unsaid. They rose only when the cold had numbed their toes. He offered her his arm, and she took it. Together, they walked back across the frost bridge, toward the palace. No one stopped them. No one asked who he was, because anyone who saw the way she looked at him already knew. The fire crackled softly. They had returned to the palace just after dusk, entering quietly through the side gates. The sentries nodded, but said nothing. The walls were the same, but everything felt different, as if the rooms themselves had been waiting, dusted with stillness, finally breathing again. Now she sat by the hearth in her old chamber, the same one where, years ago, she had penned those first trembling lines on stolen parchment, where she'd leaned against the window frame and imagined a face she had never seen. Now he was asleep just across the hall. She could hear the weight of his breathing, steady, present. It felt unreal. The candle beside her guttered in the draft. She pulled the cloak tighter around her shoulders. Then, slowly, she unfolded the envelope he had given her, the letter he never sent. The parchment was stiff and yellowed slightly at the edges, as if it had waded through seasons, rain, dust, hands that held it, and then hesitated. But because loving you became the most dangerous thing I'd ever done, and still I would do it again, 1,000 times over. She closed her eyes. The firelight danced on her lashes. She let the words sink in, deep, like warm water soaking frozen skin. You never knew this, but the day your letter first reached me, I had just come from a battlefield. Not the kind with swords, the kind inside a tent, where they decide how many lives are acceptable to lose for a single mile of ground. And then, there you were, on the back of a requisition list, a line of poetry that made no military sense, but somehow made the world seem less cruel. I didn't believe in fate before that, but something shifted. You asked nothing of me, you just existed. And in a life full of orders and maps and blood, you were the only thing that felt freely chosen. Tears welled in her eyes. She had never imagined what his world had looked like on the other side of those scrolls. She had only seen her own, her garden, her silence. She had never imagined the war behind his words. I tried to stop replying after the 4th letter. I told myself it was reckless, that I was a fool for trusting parchment with a stranger's heart. But every week I found myself writing anyway. Not for strategy, not for victory, just for you. And then, one day, the letters stopped. Her hands stilled on the page. She remembered the week the courier changed, the new steward who insisted that intercepted letters were a national risk. She'd tried, gods knew she'd tried, to keep writing, but weeks became months, and eventually she had given up. She had thought he had stopped writing. All this time, when your silence came, I thought it meant you'd moved on, that perhaps you had, never meant any of it, that maybe I'd imagined the whole thing. I buried your last letter under my uniform, carried it into every city, folded it behind every battle report, read it in tents while men screamed outside. It became the only thing I couldn't leave behind. So when I finally had the chance to stop fighting, I chose not to go home. Home didn't exist anymore. You were my home. The page was damp with tears now. She held it tighter, afraid it might vanish. I don't know if I'll ever send this. Maybe by the time I find the courage, you'll be a wife. a mother, a queen with better things to do than remember a war boy who once wrote you poetry. But if you ever read this, know that loving you saved me. And if the stars are kind and the wind is right, maybe someday I'll see you again. Even if it's just from far away, I'll know it was real, and I'll be grateful until my last breath. From the boy you named in silence, who never stopped naming you in every letter, even after the ink ran out. The room was so quiet she could hear the snow melting off the window ledge. She sat for a long time, hands folded around the letter, eyes closed. This man, this boy, across maps and walked through ash, had carried her words like armor, had loved her even when the silence said not to, had come back, and now, finally, she knew the truth. It hadn't been abandoned. It had been a door, closed by someone else, and opened again, not with orders or battles, but with patience and love. She rose, clutching the letter to her chest. She crossed the hallway. The door to his room was cracked. He stirred as she entered, eyes half open. "I read it," she whispered. He sat up slowly. "I didn't mean for you to." "I'm glad I did," she said, stepping closer. "It was the most beautiful thing I've ever read, and the saddest." He looked down. "It was written for someone I thought I'd never see again." She knelt beside the bed. "And now that you see me," he looked up, and in his eyes, no hesitation, no fear, only that same raw, unwavering devotion. "Now I don't know how to stop loving you." She touched his face. "Don't." They stayed like that, not as royalty, not as a soldier or princess, just as the two people who had once reached across enemy lines with ink and longing and hope. Now, at last, there was no parchment between them, no locked gates, no war, only the space between their hands, and that space was finally closing. The castle had many rooms, vast, echoing halls, carved from cold stone and shuttered windows, older than memory. But there was one door she had never seen before. It was hidden at the end of the eastern corridor, the one no one ever walked, the corridor that led to nowhere, just a blank stretch of wall where the tapestries hung too low, and the silence felt a little heavier. But that day, while fleeing the council chamber after yet another argument over trade tariffs, her heart pounding from a different ache entirely, she saw it, a sliver of light between stones, a hinge, a gap where the wall gave way, just slightly, like it was breathing. She should have turned back. She was already late for embroidery lessons, and her maid would soon notice her absence. But something inside her stirred, the same quiet pull that led her to slip letters through cracks and kiss paper before folding it. She pushed gently. The door gave way with a sigh. Dust danced in the air. The smell of old cedar and forgotten things surrounded her like a whisper. Inside, it wasn't a room, not really. It was smaller than her dressing chamber, low ceiling, bare floor, shelves filled with weathered books, faded scrolls, tiny maps with notes scribbled in a hand she didn't recognize. But there was something else, something stranger, a table against the far wall, and on it, carefully laid out, were letters, dozens of them, tied with a single strand of red silk. They weren't hers, they were his. Letters written in the same hand answered her in the margins of supply lists and scraps of war paper. But these were longer, deeper, pages and pages, addressed not to her, but to no one. Some were angry, some were soft. All of them were folded neatly and dated, but never sent. One read, "I dreamt of the garden again, of hands I've never held, of a voice I've only heard through ink." If this is madness, I don't want to be sane. Another, scribbled hastily on the back of a logistics report, simply said, I almost left this war today, not for survival, for her. And one, the one on top, was the hardest to read. There are days I don't believe you're real, but I write anyway, because pretending you are is the only thing that still makes sense. She sank slowly to the floor. She didn't know how long she stayed there, rereading, retracing, inhaling ink that had dried months ago. Her throat burned. Her chest ached in places that had been numb for years. He hadn't just written back, he had written everything. When she finally stood, the red silk ribbon still looped around her fingers, she noticed something tucked in the side of the shelf. A worn leather notebook. Inside it, one line. If I don't make it back, this is where I kept the parts of me no one else saw. She didn't cry, not there. But that night, when the rain tapped gently on her windows and the guards rotated on the walls, she sat down with fresh ink, and for the first time in days, she wrote, I found your words today. I read every one, and now I know I'm not the only one who's been waiting. She signed it differently, just once, with her name. With the name she'd never dared to write before. And in the morning, before the fog had lifted, she returned to the secret room. She didn't leave the letter under a stone. She didn't hide it between reports. She placed it directly in the center of the table. On top of all his unsent words, a reply, years late, but not too late. It was the kind of summer that lives only in the mind, sun-washed and golden, stitched together with the scent of lilacs and clean hay. She was 7. Her name was still spoken sweetly back then. No title, no bowing, just a girl with dirt under her fingernails and ribbons tangled in her hair. Her governess had fallen ill that week, and in a rare stroke of mercy, the Queen allowed her to travel with the staff on the annual border harvest. It was a treaty tradition. Every summer, the kingdom sent their carriages to the disputed riverlands to help tend the. It was symbolic, more than anything, but the gesture kept the peace. And that year, they had brought the youngest princess along to see the people. He was there too, but not as a guest. He was the son of a soldier. His father was posted along the southern edge, a man who had served through 3 regimes and owed his home to loyalty, not nobility. The boy was there to work. Like every other child that week, he was given a worn satchel, a chipped cup, and a place in the rows of golden wheat. She saw him on the second day. He wasn't the loudest or wheat, the fastest, but he was the only one who gave away his food. She'd watched him from the safety of her shaded tent, a cloth-draped pavilion with chilled fruit and fresh water brought in every hour. He didn't know he was being watched. He was too busy sneaking his bread into the hand of a smaller boy with sunburnt cheeks and shoes held together by twine. That was when she decided to run. She snuck out that night, barefoot. The guards were distracted, drinking and rolling dice under the torchlight. Her maid had long since fallen asleep, and the stars, bold and sharp in the countryside sky, lit the path like lanterns. She wasn't sure what she was looking for. Maybe she wanted to see if he'd do it again. Maybe she wanted to speak to someone who didn't call her Your Grace. She found him by the riverbank, kneeling, skipping stones. He looked up, paused, didn't bow. That was the first thing she noticed. No bow, no fear, just a blink and a frown and a shrug, like her presence ruined the quiet. Princesses aren't supposed to be out here, he said. She crossed her arms. How do you know I'm a princess? He tilted his head. You're the only one here who doesn't have dirt on their knees." They didn't speak for long. She didn't ask his name, he didn't ask hers, but they sat for almost an hour by the edge of the water. He told her how many stones it took to get to the center of the river. She told him how many languages she could say hello in. When she sneezed, he gave her his scarf, ragged, threadbare, and warm with sweat. When he stood to leave, he didn't bow again, but he did something else. He smiled, just once, just barely, but it stuck with her. The next morning, they were gone. Her carriage had left at dawn, recalled early due to unrest in the north. She'd left the scarf folded under a tree, thinking he'd come back for it. He never did. She never saw his face again. Not until the letters. Not until the fifth reply, when he mentioned the river. Said he used to know the stones by heart, but the current had changed. Something in her chest tightened. Could it be? No. It wasn't possible. Too many years. Too much time still. The next time she wrote, she ended her letter with a single line. "Do you believe people ever meet more than once without knowing it?" He never answered the question directly, but weeks later, his letter ended with this: "I lost a scarf once, a long time ago. Someone folded it under a tree. That was how they discovered it, that they had known each other before they knew anything at all. Not as a soldier and royal, not as enemies' children, but as a girl in the night, and a boy with stones in his hand, and a river running between them. They were bound long before the first letter was ever sent. Bound by a moment they had both almost forgotten, and had somehow, against all odds, both remembered. The garden had always been hers, or at least it had felt that way. Since she was a child, it had been her secret world, a walled stretch of ivy-covered stone, tucked just behind the west wing of the palace, not part of the formal courtyards where the nobles drank tea, and not near the parade paths where generals showed off their horses. This one was older, welder, more forgotten. It had no marble statues, no imported roses, just tall grass, thorny vines, and a willow tree that curved like it was bowing to her. This was where she hid, from tutors, from suitors, from royal lessons about silk trade and sword treaties. It was in this garden that she read her first book by candlelight, where she once screamed so loudly after an argument with her mother that birds flew out of the hedges like a spell had been broken. The garden didn't judge, it didn't ask questions, it didn't care about her title. It was hers, but not anymore. She noticed the change slowly, like autumn coming one leaf at a time. At first, it was just small things, footprints that weren't hers in the soft dirt near the eastern gate, the smell of unfamiliar leather, a torn scrap of cloth on the vine trellis, as if someone had climbed it too quickly. Then came the noise. One morning, she woke early, before the cooks, before the bells, and crept into the garden with her blanket and a piece of stale cake. She wanted quiet, but instead she heard voices, low male soldiers. She froze, peered through the branches. They weren't in uniform, at least not in the polished kind she'd grown up around. No crests, no armor, just worn, brown coats and boots caked with mud. Their swords weren't ceremonial. They looked used. They were laughing, passing a flask between them and speaking in a dialect she half understood, the southern accent of the river borderlands. Her heart jumped. Were they from the other side? Had the council allowed enemy patrols inside the palace grounds? No, they wore no insignia at all. She slipped away before they could see her, but the next day they were back. This time, there were 5 of them. 1 standing guard near the gate, 3 unpacking crates, and 1 reading what looked like a map. They didn't see her in the shadows behind the ivy. She counted every breath, every boot step. They weren't just resting, they were setting up. She went to her mother that evening, asked gently, cautiously, why there were strangers in her garden. The Queen's eyes stayed fixed on her paperwork. They're here on orders, she said. Temporary military command. A field dispatch station for communications. But in the garden, there's nowhere else private enough. The words stung. Private. The garden had always been private because it was hers. Now it belonged to soldiers and wires and whispering men with flasks. She tried not to ask more questions. She knew what would happen if she pushed, and sure enough, within the week, a lock appeared on the southern gate. It wasn't decorative. It was iron, thick, functional. Her key no longer worked. She didn't cry. She didn't shout. She simply waited for a time when no one would be looking. And when the moon was full and the hall silent, she returned with a different key, a bent hairpin, and a flame-warmed knife. It took her 20 minutes, a few scraped fingers, and 1 whispered apology to the tree she used for balance, but she got in. The garden was darker now. The soldiers had left for the evening, or perhaps shifted to another wing. The crates were still there, now covered with tarps. A tent had been pitched beside the wall. The grass was trampled. It looked broken, but her willow tree was still standing. She went to it, sat beneath it, pressed her palm to the roots like a prayer, and it was there, in that quiet moment, that she heard the smallest sound, a rustle, a brush of something sliding down the bark. She looked up, a paper, tucked into the high crook of the tree, held in place with a rusted nail. She climbed, slowly, silently, and pulled it free. It wasn't addressed to her. It wasn't meant for anyone. Just a piece of parchment, scribbled in rough script, like someone had written it in the dark, or in a hurry, or against their better judgment. They say we're not supposed to feel anything, but this place, it makes me remember what silence feels like. And sometimes, when I can't sleep, I come here, and I imagine someone else sitting beneath this tree. Someone who hasn't given up yet. There was no name, no signature, just those few lines, then blank space. She held the letter to her chest. It didn't matter who wrote it, not yet. It only mattered that someone else had seen the garden the way she had, not as a place for war, but as a place to be. That night, she didn't sleep. She sat on the floor of her room, parchment spread before her, hands shaking with the thought that maybe, just maybe, this was something real. Not a game, not a secret mission, just one voice calling out into the quiet, and maybe another listening. She picked up her pen and began to write. That was the night she wrote the very first letter that wasn't a poem. The first letter that came from the heart she had never let speak. A letter about what the garden had meant to her. About how her childhood was tied to those roots. About the way grief had a shape, and hers looked like vines growing over an old stone path. She didn't sign it, just folded it carefully, tied it with string, and left it in the same crook of the tree before sunrise. The next night, the paper was gone, and a new one, a reply, was waiting in its place. No greeting, no name, just this. I think I sat where you sat. The roots slope inward, just slightly, like a cradle. I didn't realize it until I read your letter. Maybe that's why it feels safe. She smiled for the first time in weeks. The garden was no longer hers, but it was something else now. not a place to keep, but a place to share. And sometimes that's more powerful than ownership could ever be. She had never told him her name. Not once. Not in all the letters. She'd signed them with 100 things, from the girl in the garden, a ghost behind the curtain, the one who waits by the willow, but never her true name. It wasn't forgetfulness. It wasn't shyness. It was fear, because names are dangerous. Names are anchors. And in her world, names meant blood. Allegiance, danger. A name could ruin a man. A name could bring a war crashing through the walls of a hidden life. She told herself it was for his safety, and maybe it was at first. But as the months passed, as the letters grew longer, softer, heavier with truth, she started to wonder if the real reason was simpler, that maybe if she gave her name, he wouldn't love her anymore. Not the way he did now. Not as the voice on the other side of the paper. Not as the shadow he imagined beneath the moonlight. Because that girl was soft-spoken, poetic, and warm. That girl could be anyone. And somehow, being anyone, being no one, felt safer than being herself. She didn't lie in the letters. Not really. But she let him believe things. Let him imagine the world he wanted. He thought she was a noblewoman's maid, a girl who worked in the background of diplomacy, maybe. Someone who overheard things, who delivered scrolls and watered roses and had time to dream. And she let that fantasy live because the truth was far more dangerous. She wasn't a maid. She wasn't a background voice. She was the daughter of the king, the princess of a fractured court, the girl whose name had been carved into treaties, the one whose face had once been sewn into enemy banners as a warning. And he was the son of the man sworn to kill her father. They were names that could never share the same air, let alone the same sentence. So no, she didn't write her name, even when she knew his. He had told her, softly, hidden between the lines. In one letter, he wrote of his brother's funeral. He wrote the name of the boy who had died and signed it, from the brother who remained. She read it again and again, the name, his name, and then she folded it into her pillowcase and slept with it by her ear. She said it silently to herself, once, twice, but she never wrote it back, because once names appear, so does fate, and fate had no room for their kind of love. Still, she longed to say it. There were moments midnight, in the hush of winter storms, ink trembling on her fingers, when she would almost write it, his name, her name, together. But the quill would hover, and her courage would falter. In the letter she never sent tucked away in a drawer, hidden beneath layers of folded gowns, she wrote, "If I had met you in another life, I would have told you my name the first night. I would have whispered it against your collarbone like a prayer, and let it live there. But in this life, my name is a lock, and the key is buried too deep." She kept writing to him anyway, and he kept replying always to the girl in the garden. But some nights, when the words on the page felt especially tender, especially knowing, she wondered, did he already know? Did he guess who she was? Had he pieced it together from the things she hadn't said? And if he had, why didn't he ever let on? Perhaps he was protecting her, too. Perhaps his silence was the only way he could love her safely. So the letters continued, word after word, thought after thought, always addressed to someone nameless, faceless, hidden in shadow, but never meaningless. Because sometimes the most honest parts of love live in the things that aren't said. And in that silence, in that sacred, unspoken place, they met each other fully, not as princess and soldier, not as enemies, children, but simply as two people who knew what it meant to be lonely and to be heard. And sometimes, she thought, maybe that was enough. There were nights the sky felt closer than the world around them. Nights when she would lie beneath the ancient stone arches of the courtyard, the cold flagstones pressing through her gown, and stare upward until the stars blurred and swam like tears across her vision. She would wonder if he was seeing the same sky, not in the romantic way books described, not in the naive belief that the stars had answers, but in the quiet hope that distance might, somehow, still mean together. Because no one in her world knew, no one knew that the girl who stood silent in court chambers, who bowed and curtsied and kept her face unreadable, would return to her chamber each night and unwrap pieces of his lifelike gifts. No one knew that. Hidden behind the third panel of the bookshelf, where her governess thought she kept histories and treaties, there were stacks of folded papers, sink-stained, soft at the corners, sometimes tear-marked. She had never let herself imagine a future. It was too dangerous, too indulgent. But she had imagined what his voice would sound like. She had imagined him leaning against a crooked doorway, brushing snow from his shoulders, lifting his eyes and seeing her not as a stranger, not as an enemy, but as the voice who had met him in letters long before either of them had faces. In one letter, he described the wind outside his barracks as angry, then crossed it out and wrote lonely. That one word undid her, because she knew the difference. She knew what it meant to stare out a frost-covered window and feel the weight of wanting, without knowing what it was she wanted. And when she wrote back, she didn't try to answer him. She simply wrote, "I've never seen snow, but I know what a lonely wind sounds like." She didn't describe her day. She didn't write about the conflict, or the tension, or the court rumors about troop movements near the border. She just wrote, feeling, and that had become their language. Some nights she would say nothing at all. She would press flower petals between the pages, or send tiny sketches, the shadow of the fountain at sunset, her slipper next to a raven's footprint, the broken clasp of a locket she hadn't opened in years. And somehow, he always understood. He never asked questions. He never pressed, but in his letters, he would echo her silence with his own. Once, he sent a single dried blade of grass, nothing else. She understood. It was from the hillside he had written about. The one, he said, reminded him of childhood. She held it between her palms like it was something sacred, because it was. It wasn't about the grand words. It was about the way they chose not to speak. How they both understood that the space between sentences could carry more weight than the words themselves. There were things they couldn't say not, because they didn't feel them, but because once spoken, they could never be taken back. She couldn't tell him she wanted to see his face. He couldn't ask her if she'd ever come. They couldn't confess what it meant that they waited, each week, for something as small as ink on paper. Because once they did, it would mean something real. And reality was a crueler world than parchment and poetry. So they stayed in that space between, in the breath before a name, in the echo between stars, in the ache of knowing that some things can never be said not because they aren't true, but because they're too true. And every night she would press her palm to the sky, not in prayer, not in hope, but in quiet companionship. Because somewhere, maybe on a hill, maybe in a trench, maybe in the shadow of an enemy banner, a boy with tired hands and a scar across his cheek might be doing the same. The stars never answered, but they didn't need to. He never said he would come back, and she never asked him to. That was the unspoken agreement between them, to never speak of the future, because the future was a fragile, shivering thing, too easy to shatter. But the truth is, she waited. Not like a woman waits for a knight in the old stories. No, not with roses, or songs, or whispered prayers at windows. She waited the way wild things do, quiet, watchful, half believing the wind might carry his voice home. She watched the border tower every morning through her mirror. It was silly, really. She told herself it was for the sunrise, for the way the first light painted the gray stone gold. But some mornings, especially the cold ones, especially the ones when the fog never lifted, she imagined seeing a rider come over that ridge. She didn't need him to have a flag, or a trumpet, or a reason. She just wanted him. There was no promise between them, no vow, only paper and silence, and the memory of hands that had never touched, but still she waited. He wrote less often now. The war was moving, they said, shifting toward the coast. His father, the general, had sent messengers to the palace twice, asking for more grain, more iron, more maps. Each time, she delivered them with a mask she'd perfected, the mask of the princess, the dutiful daughter, the girl who stood at her father's right hand and never blinked when the council said her name like a chess piece. But behind that mask, her breath caught with every delivery, every letter could be the last. Every absence stretched her thinner. She tried to write, tried to believe in the rhythm of it. But the ink dried faster now. The words didn't come the same way, until one night, in the same spot behind the willow tree, she found something strange. Not a letter, not a poem, just a stone, a river stone, perfectly round, worn soft by years of water. It was warm from the sun, wrapped in a torn strip of linen, with a tiny sketch folded underneath. It was a drawing of a place she'd never seen before. A small wooden bridge, a crooked tree beside a stream. In the corner of the page, he'd written, "If I make it home, this is where I'll wait." That was it. No name, no goodbye, just a map drawn in memory and a place he carried inside him. She didn't weep. She just folded it gently, held it to her chest, and whispered back to the silence, "If you wait, I'll find you." No one else knew what she was doing. Not her maid, not the court, not even the captain of her own guards, who had begun to grow suspicious of her long evening walks and quiet stares out the window. But she had learned how to move like smoke. She learned how to steal away between bells. She learned that if you act important enough, no one stops you. And she learned that love, real love, doesn't need a wedding or a witness. It needs only a place, a memory, and a promise never made. That winter, the last letter came. There was no wax seal, no signature, just a square of thick parchment, dirt-smeared and faint, with the scent of ash. The ink was jagged, uneven, like it had been written in a rush, like he hadn't meant to say anything at all, but couldn't help himself. He had written only one line, "If this letter reaches you, I'm still alive." And below it, a second, "If it doesn't, I hope you kept the sketch." She didn't cry that night, either. She just sat by the fire, the sketch in one hand and the letter in the other, and whispered over and over, "Come back, come back, come back," as if saying it softly enough might convince the stars, as if the fire might carry her voice through the wind. But the thing is, he'd never promised. He never said he would return, and she had never asked. That was the cruelest kind of love, not the one that breaks with screaming, not the one that ends with betrayal, but the kind that grows inside you without permission, and stays even when it has no place to live. And though they had never touched, never kissed, never stood in the same room, their hearts had already tied something between them, a thread spun in ink, in memory, in the hush between letters, a thread that would hold even if the war took everything else. He hadn't drawn it for her. Not exactly. It was a memory, sketched in the dark, the kind of place you think of when you're trying not to fall apart. A place your mind runs to when your hands are cold, your boots are wet, and the sky won't stop burning. It wasn't much, just crooked bridge across a slow-moving stream, an old willow tree with one twisted limb reaching down like a mother's hand, wildflowers growing in patches, the kind you don't plant. They just arrive, like gifts. But to him, it was everything, because when he was a boy, before his father had hardened, before the blood and the banners and the drills, that stream was the one place where no one followed him. He'd sit there for hours with his boots in the water, sketching the trees, feeding the birds breadcrumbs he'd snuck from the kitchen. He hadn't been back in years, not since the army claimed him, not since he stopped being just a boy and became the son of a general. But the image had never left. It lived in the soft parts of his memory, the part untouched by smoke and shouting. And when he first started writing to her, the girl in the garden, he had thought of it constantly, not because he imagined she'd ever go there, but because when he pictured her voice, it sounded like that place felt. She stared at the drawing for days. She traced the lines, with her fingertip the slanted bridge, the willow, the uneven edges of the water. She asked no one, told no one, but in her heart she knew this was a message, a secret invitation, a direction with no coordinates. He hadn't said when or if. He hadn't even signed it with his name. But she understood. He was asking her to believe in something without proof, to trust that if he lived, he made it through the fire and the steel and the torn-up fields. If he returned, that's where he'd be. And if she came, well, that would mean something. Spring came early that year. The snow melted fast. The garden bloomed in silence. The letters stopped. No word, no scrolls, no sketches, no signs. Weeks passed, then months. She kept the sketch in the pocket of her cloak, folded in oilskin, close to her chest. Sometimes she unfolded it just to remind herself it was real. She imagined it so vividly she could smell the stream water, hear the bees in the tall grass. It became the only place in the world where her heart didn't hurt. She dreamed of it sometimes. Not him, just the bridge, just the moment before a voice would say her name. One morning, with no warning, the war ended. It didn't end with a parade or a treaty or a banner. It ended with silence. A messenger arrived at the palace gates with a blood-stained ledger and a list of names. The general was dead. The eastern border had held. The son had not returned with the final caravan. The court celebrated. The threat was gone. The enemy was defeated. And no one noticed the girl who slipped away before sunset. She rode through the night alone. No guards, no ladies, no gold, only a satchel, the sketch, and her own trembling hands. The map had no labels, no roads, but something in her, some part of her trained by letters and longing, knew exactly where to go. She rode east, past the old ruins, through a glade of black pines, until the hills rose like old shoulders above her. And just as dawn was breaking, she saw it, the bridge, crooked and faded with moss. The willow, older now, branches longer, bent with time, The stream still ran, quiet, clear, and beneath the tree, on the patch of wildflowers, lay a coat. His coat, faded, weather-worn, folded like someone meant to return. She fell to her knees, not because she was heartbroken, but because she didn't know what it meant. Had he been here? Was this years old? Was he still alive? Had he waited? She ran her hands over the fabric, still soft, still warm from the sun, and in the breast pocket, tucked carefully beneath a button, was a letter, unsealed, no name, just 3 words scrawled on the front. If you came. Her hands shook. She opened it, slowly. Inside were just 2 lines. I, Dan T, know if you ever find this place. But if you do, you were worth the wait. Nothing else. No instructions, no date. But behind her, a twig snapped, soft, gentle, and when she turned, she saw him, dirt on his boots, a satchel on his shoulder, a scar across his cheek. But his eyes, they hadn't changed, and neither had hers. They didn't run to each other, they didn't speak. They just stood still, like the world had finally stopped spinning. And in that stillness, every letter they'd ever written passed between them again. Every word, every silence, every ache. They had never made a promise, but somehow they had both kept it. She didn't recognize him at first, not because he had changed, but because he hadn't. It had been for years, for winters, for harvests, for birthdays she had spent alone. And yet, as she stood at the edge of the worn stone bridge that curved like a question mark through the field, it was as if no time had passed at all. There he was, sitting on the flat edge of the stone, hunched over his boots, arms resting on his knees, the same way he always sat, one elbow slightly crooked, his sword on the ground beside him, not across his lap like before. No armor now, just linen, worn and loose, the sleeves rolled to the elbows. There was dust on his boots and shadows under his eyes. He didn't hear her at first. She didn't say anything. She was afraid if she opened her mouth, the whole world would rush out. Tears, letters, anger, laughter, everything she had locked away since the last time their shadows overlapped. So, instead, she just breathed, and for a moment, that was enough. Then, slowly, he looked up, not in shock, not in fear. Almost like he knew she would be there, like he had sensed her long before she stepped onto the bridge. Their eyes met, but somehow, there it was. The moment that had rewritten itself in both their minds every night for 4 years. No letters now, no paper, no hiding behind ink, just air and silence. And the 2 of them grown, a little older, a little more tired, a little more themselves. He stood, not quickly, not dramatically, as if unsure whether he should. His lips parted, like maybe he had 1,000 things to say. But the weight of them had tied his voice. She opened her mouth too, but nothing came. There was no script for this part, no elegant letter, no title, just the noise of the wind, the rustle of the willow trees behind her, the ache in her chest that hadn't left since the last letter she never sent. And then, very slowly, he stepped forward, one step, then another. She didn't move, couldn't. She had imagined this in every form, that he would yell, or weep, or turn away, that he might have married, that he might have forgotten, that he might not forgive her for the silence. But he didn't do any of that. When he was close enough, he raised his hand, and gently, softly, carefully, as though brushing dust from a sleeping statue, he tucked a stray piece of hair behind her ear and said nothing, because nothing needed to be said. In that quiet space between them, something settled. Not fireworks, not thunder, just warmth, recognition, kind of peace that doesn't announce itself, the kind of love that has already happened long before the lips say it out loud. Her eyes filled, not with grief, not with regret, but with something more dangerous, hope, because he didn't ask where she'd been. He didn't ask why she stopped writing. He didn't ask why she took 4 years to come back. Instead, he whispered the only thing he needed to say, "Are you home?" She nodded, once, slowly, and whispered back, "If you are." He smiled. And it was the kind of smile she remembered from the 5th letter, the one he ended with, "I hope the garden is still blooming." It wasn't, but it would be again. Together, without saying a word, they turned and walked back across the bridge, back toward the place they had dreamed of from both sides of the war. No one else saw them that morning. No guards, no whispers, number, noise, just 2 silhouettes disappearing into the sunlit mist. What they said without speaking was more than all the letters combined, and somehow that was the beginning again. The palace walls had grown quiet, not with peace, but with the kind of stillness that follows a long storm. The court still whispered about her return, about the boy from the enemy's side, walked beside her now like a shadow that chose to stay. But inside the rooms that mattered, inside her rooms, there was no whispering, only paper and ink and a letter she never sent. It had been written months before she returned, folded 12 times, hidden beneath floorboards, bound in a ribbon of her own hair. She had written it one night under a straw-thatched roof in the village she had hidden in, when the war was beginning to thin out, and the soldiers had stopped looking. The fire had been low. Her fingers are cold. Her ink is made from crushed berries and ash. The words came slowly, not because she didn't know what to say, but because she knew too much. She wrote it like a farewell. "If I ever come back, it won't be as the girl in the garden. It will be something else, someone braver, I hope. But if I don't, I wanted you to know you are the only reason I stayed human." She sealed it, addressed it to no one, and then buried it like a prayer. She never meant for anyone to find it, but he did. How he found it. 3 days after she returned, after that morning on the bridge, where nothing was spoken and everything was understood, he asked if he could go to the room where she used to sleep, the little stone quarters beneath the council tower, the one with the vine-covered windows and the willow tree shadowing the sill. She let him, didn't follow, and he went, alone. The room hadn't changed much, dustier, colder, but still her. The ink stains on the desk, the half-burned candle, the pressed lavender tucked between pages of an unfinished book, a sketch she never finished on the wall, a silhouette under a tree that looked suspiciously like the one she always sat beneath. He wandered, touching little things with care, and then, as if some ancient instinct pulled him, he knelt by the floorboard near the foot of the bed. One was slightly looser than the others, just slightly, a thread of ribbon peeking through the crack. He didn't pry it open, he lifted it like something sacred. Inside, a letter, worn but sealed, still scented faintly of crushed thyme and berries. He knew the handwriting immediately. He didn't read it right away. Instead, he walked it back to her, held it out like an offering. She froze when she saw it. "Where did you beneath the floor?" he said, softly. "I think it wanted to be found." She didn't speak for a while, and then, eyes low, voice quiet, she said, "I don't know if I want you to read it." He looked at her with that same gentle patience he had written into every letter years ago. "Then maybe," he said, "you can read it to me." And so she did. That night, by candlelight, with the windows open and the willow tree rustling, she read aloud the letter she had written when she still thought the world would never let them find each other again. Her voice trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of remembering who she used to be. She read every line about the ache of longing, about the day she realized she loved him, about the fear of never being enough, not as a princess, not as a girl, not even as a writer. And finally, about the moment she let herself hope, just a little, that one day he might come for her, even if she didn't believe she deserved it. When she finished, there was a long silence. Then he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out his letter, the one he had written the night before she returned, folded, worn from being read too many times. He had never sent it, because he didn't know where to send it. But he had written it anyway, hoping the words would find her, wherever she was. If you're still out there, I don't need a name. I don't need a title. I just need to know you're breathing under the same sky. Come back when you're ready. I'll still be here, in the garden, with the ink, with the words you gave me. She didn't cry. She didn't have to, because some letters don't need tears, only silence. That night, they exchanged those 2 pages, hers for his for hers. And for the first time since the war began, since the first poem in the scroll basket, since the paper with "less like war" scribbled across it, they didn't need to write anymore, because the story had turned a page, not to the end, but to something even better. A chapter written side by side. There is a kind of ending that doesn't arrive all at once. It doesn't break like thunder or crash like war. It unfolds softly, like morning light on old stones, like a letter arriving long after it was needed, but still exactly when it should. And that's how their story ends. Not with a kiss, not even with the words, "I love you," but with peace and everything that came after. The war was over. It ended, not with glory, but with fatigue. The generals returned to their halls. The banners were lowered. The graves were counted. The noise of years slipped into the quiet, and in that quiet, 2 figures remained, not on a throne, not in a garden, but beside each other. They did not marry right away, he asked, once, but she said no, not because she didn't want to, but because she wanted to live first, to breathe, not as a daughter or a princess or a name on paper, but as a woman, whole and unscripted. So they built a life that didn't need a title. They woke early, before the sun, and walked to the edge of the city where the trees still whispered. They shared bread with quiet hands and talked about nothing for hours. They adopted a dog that didn't like people but adored her. They named it Letter. He grew herbs in windowsills. She wrote stories she never published. Once a week, they visited the willow tree, the same one where she left that first folded note, long before she believed in answers. There they buried things, old fears, bad memories, unfinished drafts. One time, a lock of her hair she cut when she decided to start over. They didn't go to royal banquets. They didn't rebuild the palaces. They built a school instead, and they taught letters, not the alphabet, but letters. How to write your heart into paper. How to read what isn't spoken. How to wait for answers that may never come. Children came from both sides of the border. No one cared where they were born, only that they could write and be heard. One day, years later, she found him beneath the willow, older now, with lines by his eyes and gray in his hair. He had fallen asleep with a letter in his lap. It wasn't hers, it wasn't anyone's, just a story. Hafferton, she smiled, sat beside him, and didn't wake him. Because some moments don't need to be shared, only kept. In the end, they grew old, together. Not always side by side, but always toward each other. Sometimes she would leave the house just to see if he'd notice, and he always did. He never stopped answering her, even when she stopped asking. They were never famous. No monuments, no titles etched in gold. But somewhere in the kingdom once torn by war, there are still two trees, a willow and a fig, and beneath them, buried deep in a metal box, wrapped in waxed cloth, are every letter they ever wrote, folded carefully, read 1,000 times, stained with rain, ink, time, and at the top of the pile, the very first one, to the girl in the garden. Your words made this week feel less like war. So here's the ending. Not a wedding, not a battlefield, just two people, once strangers, now home. Two hearts that once whispered across silence, now resting in it. Because love, the real kind, doesn't always shout. Sometimes it writes quietly and waits. And if you ever find yourself awake at night, feeling like your story won't be heard, feeling like your letters go unread, remember, somewhere once, in a kingdom carved by war, a girl wrote words to no one, and someone wrote back,